Welcome. This is Tommy Ruke with part 4 of the 4-hour, 1-hour segments discussing inland marine coverage and in particular cargo coverage. If you have any questions during this presentation, please type it in the chat window and we'll attempt to answer it during the presentation. If we do not have time, we'll answer it with email after the presentation is over. Also, if you have problems with the audio or other parts of this program, again, if it's still available to you, type in the chat window and we'll try to address the problem, or call our office at 800-741-4084 and we'll attempt to answer the questions or rectify the problems. You must attend all 4 hours of the presentations to be provided the 4 hours of CE credit. Briefly recapping, coverage for property while in transit, away from the insured's premises. This has been our discussion for the last 3 hours that we're going to conclude today with the 4th hour. For a private carrier, there's someone that's defined under our presentation as a private carrier. They haul their own goods. So while their property is in transit, they will need coverage, whether they provide the transportation or another carrier provides the transportation or for-hire carrier on their behalf. Most of the time they're covered with a property form or inland marine form called a transit coverage, which covers the owner of the property, not the entity who's providing the transportation. Most of the business that we deal with, though, in the realm of the Motor Carriers Insurance Education Foundation is the for-hire motor carrier. Their business is transportation of other people's property. When you have any other person's property in your possession, the legal system make you take legal care of it, take reasonable care of it, take prudent care of it, those words that you will hear. That responsibility is a bailee responsibility. So what we have is a situation where it's a legal liability obligation, yet the legal liability forms that we provide on behalf of our for-hire motor carrier, either a general liability policy and or a auto liability policy, both of them have an exclusion in it that says we do not cover property in your care, custody, control. So the first basis of the for-hire motor carrier cargo form is to buy back the bailee responsibility. This is a unique type of coverage. It's property coverage, which is subject to work exclusions and coverage of losses consideration, but it's also triggered by being legally liable. So it's property of others, which is your insured's customer. Damage during transportation. What's expected? Everything is expected to be covered. That's the expectations of both the insured and the customer of the insured. If the policy is not handled properly, they could have a loss beyond being legally liable, which then might not trigger coverage. The concern that we have, or I have in this situation, is to remember that this coverage is for property of the customer of our insureds. So if not properly handled, then the relationship of our insured with their customer can be interrupted. To this end, I feel that this is the most important claim or important coverage afforded to our motor carriers because it involves their ongoing business relationship with their customers. The motor carrier's legal liability form, again, which is the one that we're going to discuss today, which is the primary one that you deal with, protects the insured, the motor carrier, if the property is being transported, is damaged. Not only when it's stolen, but also when a crash happens. Will the cargo form being provided to the motor carrier pay the loss? That is the question. There is a document of transportation. This is the very key part of this, both at underwriting and at review by the retail agent and at claim time. The bill of lading is a contract of carriage. It shows who shipped it. It shows who is providing the protection, who's responsible for the property, the motor carrier, where it's being delivered, what's being transported, both type and number, and the care of the property. When a loss happens, you start there to determine if there's coverage and the responsibility coverage, and from an underwriting standpoint, we need to understand what is being transported and who our insurance customers are. The key consideration that we went through in last hours is the shipment subject to the Carmack Amendment. Carmack Amendment is a federal act addressing all interstate transportation for any commodities except for fresh fruit and vegetable, farm goods, agriculture goods, and seafood goods. That Carmack Amendment spells out the responsibility that the motor carrier has, which is absolute, except for the 5 situations which we went through earlier: acts of God, quarantine, war, shipper error, or inherent vice. The most important of that we might not be responsible for would be shipper error. If the shipper does not tell us in the bill of lading where to deliver or how to take care of it, then we would have some recourse against not paying. It also does not make us responsible for consequential damages. That's loss of market. This is where if the shipment doesn't get there on time and the factory has no more material to process, therefore losing income, we're not responsible for it if the shipment's under Carmack. If it's just on time delivery where the florist doesn't have the flowers to be sold the next day because our motor carrier didn't get there on time, then we're also not responsible for that under Carmack. Very important consideration. We need to review the bill of ladings. We need to see who our insurance customers are. We need to see what they're being what types of items they're transporting. We need to see where they're going. We need to see what kind of care it takes. They're responsible for the property that they're being transported, and we need to determine if it's under the Carmack Amendment or not, both at policy issuance, at underwriting, and at claim time. So now, though, let's look at the coverage forms. When you provide cargo coverage, you need to think errors and omission, excitement and opportunity time. This is because every form can be different. I'm going through some examples, none of which will be completely of every example can have, just to show you where there are some variances in the coverages, the thing you need to be aware of as you read each policy or review each policy. So to determine if you have the coverage to cover your insured operation is the first key. You need to talk to them. You need to find out what they're hauling, and then you need to find the coverage for what they're hauling. You must read and understand the policies you are providing. I know that's tough for you to think about, but you need to do it at both original writing and also at renewal time. You must understand the policies you could have provided if you had access to it, or you had access to it and chose not to present it because of price or other consideration, hopefully not commission, but that would be a part of it too. You must be aware of the policies that you are replacing, whether it's done in your agency or done from another agent, because at a loss time, if the previous policy would have covered the loss and the one you are now providing does not cover the loss, then again you could have those excitement and opportunity times. So those are your considerations. Find out what the insured does, what they haul, where they haul to it, how they take care of it, how well the drivers are trained to take care of it. You need to read and look at the policies and understand both what's covered and what's not covered. Then you will find the right policy to cover your insured, but you need to compare to see if there was policies that would cover some areas or some restrictions in policies that the insured might not be able to conform to that would have given coverage. And again, if you replace a policy, you need to make sure your policy covers what the policy that you replaced covered, or point out in unequivocal terms that would not be disputed later where those differences are. Let me tell you a story. Some of you have heard me talk about this in other presentations we have done, but early on in my business career, you might remember that I was an International Harvester truck dealership. My father, who, as most of you know, was a trucker, when I graduated from Wake Forest College in the middle 60s, he just gained the International Harvester truck franchise dealer in Fort Myers, Florida. For you who are used to the west coast of Florida, you might, in the 60s, we only had about 25,000 people here. Today we have over 500,000 people. Some of you northerners in the cold weather have decided that Fort Myers is a place to be, or the west coast where it's warmer. So we bought that dealership, and that's what I ended up running when I first got there. I ran that for 10 years, but then we sold the dealership, and I got in a legitimate business selling insurance. When I was a dealership, one of my #1 customer, and by the way, my favorite customer, was a local beer distributor. In fact, it drove my Southern Baptist mother crazy to think that I was contributing to 90% of all the beer that was being distributed in our geographical area, because the preferred delivery truck was an International Harvester 1600. So when I got out of the truck selling business into the insurance business, the first customer I called on was the beer company. The beer company were their friends of mine, and they allowed me to write their first coverage. They allowed me to let me write their coverage, which was the first commercial policy I ever wrote. And about 3 or 4 weeks after I delivered the policy, Greg called me up and said, "Tommy, did you read the policy that you delivered to me?" "Why do you tell Greg? Let's go have a beer?" I said, "Greg, what's the problem?" "Greg, what's the problem?" He said, "In property not covered, the policy you delivered to me excludes alcoholic beverages. What do I think beer was?" I had delivered a policy to a beer distributor that did not cover damage to, stolen items of alcoholic beverages. We clearly reconciled those. That wasn't our intention, but because I had not read the policy, and all that was delivered to me was a boilerplate policy that I did not bother to review, I got this dilemma, and my insured, who knew I knew very little about insurance, had a question here. Fortunately, we rectified it, and they became a customer of mine for a long time. But early in my insurance career, I learned you have to read the policies. So when you read the policies, you must look at the coverage. What facts will allow the policy to respond? Legal liability on a covered auto, responsible for, care, custody, control. You need to look at what property is being covered and what's not. We cover property consisting of fresh fruits and vegetables or other things, and property that's not covered. What is a covered auto? Meaning what kind of vehicle has to be involved in the accident, in the theft, in the crash that will generate the coverage. And then obviously what the exclusions are, and explain those and look at those for the insurer or provided and for our insured to have purchased. Which is the right or best policy? There's no right or best policy. It's anyone that meets the insured's needs. There's 2 types of the needs. First off, how much coverage the insured can afford, or what kind of responsibilities the insured want to take on to avoid crashes, to avoid claims, to avoid theft that they could provide protection of for a reduced premium. It's up to the insured to make those decisions. It's up to us to explain the differences and look at the considerations, and also explain the cost. For smaller insureds, they will assume some more responsibility for taking care of the property, for making sure that everything is correct on it, to make sure that their employees have been properly screened, those kind of items, because that will save some costs. For a larger risk, for risk with a whole lot of units on it, they end up making their own premium and coverage based on their past history. It's the insurer's choice, but it's our obligation as an insurance provider, particularly as a retail agent, and to find out what those needs are and to communicate those needs. As we send it to the wholesalers need to explain the various markets they have and which market they feel fits this insurer's needs the best at the cost that can be affordable. As an insurance carrier, you don't have a lot of options other than the policies that you are designed to issue to the wholesale area or directly to the retail agent. But remember, every policy will be different. We're going to look at some policy wording. This is by no means all policy wording, so don't think that I'm addressing everything that could be found in a policy. That's not my intention here. My intention is for you to look at things to see if you get familiarity with certain phrases, certain conditions, certain parts of the policy so that as you review individual policies, you're able to relate back to that. Later in this presentation, we have a checklist that we will suggest that you go through. But this is part of this looking at how these forms can be and will be different. They have different names. Motor truck cargo coverage form, carrier's cargo pack, transportation cargo coverage form, motor carrier's legal liability form, motor carrier specialty coverage form, motor carrier's coverage form preferred, legal liability form. There's really no difference in titles. Don't ever get hung up on a title of a policy, because what's important is not what the policy is called. What's important is what the policy covers. So let's look at the coverage, and the first two parts of the coverage is the granting of coverage, meaning when will the policy have to respond, and also what property is being covered and what property is not being covered. I'll give you a typical wording in a motor carrier's form. We cover legal liability coverage. We cover your legal liability for loss to a covered property while under your care, custody, and control, and that you become legally obligated to pay as common or contract carrier under a bill of lading, contract of carriage, or shipping receipt that is issued by you or that is issued on your behalf. Looking at this, this is pretty typical, but looking at this, there's a couple things here that I look at that I say that I'd want more explanation for or look at. It says care, custody, and control. That's three conditions. So to have coverage, you must have it not only in your care, but your custody and your control. You also are being legally liable as a common or contract carrier. The ironical part about this is that there's not going to be any definitions for common and contract carrier after October 2015 based on the Uniform Registration System. So after that, we don't know what you will be as far as a common or contract carrier, as if that makes a difference. You'll just be a motor carrier. That's not a bad wording here because it's not going to take coverage away. It just doesn't talk about today's truckers. Under bill of lading, contract of carriage, that's important, but here it's issued by you or that is issued on your behalf, meaning that it's your bill of lading in your name, so that if another motor carrier has it, then your policy would not respond. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. In contrast, looking at another item here where we look at this coverage for a motor carrier's legal liability form, we will pay on your behalf those sums that you become legally obligated to pay as a motor carrier for hire. Again, no longer common or contract. Physical loss of damage to covered property of others in your care, custody, or control. The previous policy said care, custody, and control, and the previous policy related to a bill of lading issued by the insured or on the insured's behalf. It also goes on a covered auto and while in the course of transportation. Notice both of those in quotation marks, so they're defined terms. So as I would read this, I'd also want to find out what is a covered auto and what is in the course of transit that will have to be considered too. So again, this seems to be a little broader in scope of coverage, or let's say another way, it has fewer restrictions, because now you don't have to have three, care, custody, and control. You just have to have one, care, custody, or control. And there's no reference to a bill of lading being in the insured's name or provided by the insured. Again, is there a different at claim time? Possibly, but enough that we need to understand these kind of differences. Another one is owner's coverage. This is on a legal liability form, but the form that we refer to in the second part is owner's coverage. We will pay for direct loss or damage to covered property you own or you have sold to others in your care, custody, control that occurs while in a covered auto while in transit. This is one thing that has happened to a lot of the, quote, modern forms that we have in them that have been rewritten. And most cargo forms have been rewritten in the very recent past, mainly because the shippers, mainly because the larger brokers are requiring broader coverages on behalf of their customer for a truck broker, or the larger shippers are doing that. So we'll also cover the owner forms in the same coverage form as the legal liability. So even though it's a legal liability coverage form, it is covering the direct damage to the owner's coverage for owners. There's one unique thing here that I point out that's probably not relevant to most of the marketplace you have. But one of the examples that I have used in the past defining these two terms is if you have gone into, let's say, a furniture store. When you go into a furniture store, you go and buy a bed or a couch or something like that. You pay for that bed or couch the day that you're there, and that now you own that bed or that chair or that couch or that dining room set, yet the furniture store arranges for and handles the delivery of it. So if all you write is coverage for owned property, then you would not have coverage for for that furniture store or that appliance store. Then I would wonder if you would have coverage for it for that property that they have sold that had to be delivered by them that now is owned by somebody else. This form addresses that concern by adding, or you have sold to others, so that then you do have coverage in that area. So if you write a coverage form just for the owner, and that owner is a store like a furniture store, appliance store who does delivery of property of others after they're sold, you do want this favorable wording, sold to others. So that would be a concern that you would want to address. Another wording, again, each form is different. We will pay those sums you become legally obligated to pay as damage for direct loss of or damage to covered property caused by or resulting from the covered cause of loss. Covered property is used in this coverage form means lawful property of others that you have accepted for transportation and for which there's a limit of coverage. Again, no requirement for care, custody, and control, no requirement for a bill of lading, no requirement for any of those other items. It's just covering the insured when they have property of others in their possession and they have accepted it for transportation purposes. This is the ultimate buyback of the care, custody, control exclusion as a bailee. It's still a legal liability form, though, and so that would be the triggering of coverage is when the insured is legally liable. That would be, in most cases, when they have taken constructive control or care of the property. A few more wordings here. Covered property is used in this coverage form means property of others described in the declaration, meaning that consisting of fresh fruit and vegetables or machinery or other items that we would have that you've accepted for transportation as a common or contract motor carrier. Again, the antiquated common and contract wording. Again, under your tariff, bill of lading, or shipping receipt issued by you. Same cover that we talked about here. But this does cover, we only cover property while in your custody or in the, as the carrier or in the custody of a connecting carrier until the property is delivered to its destination. As some of you know, there was a practice in the marketplace because of MAP 21 and the new requirements of Brokers Authority. We hope it's not prevailing anymore, where a motor carrier would pick up a load, the motor carrier would have the cargo, the bill of lading in their name, and then let another motor carrier transport it. And so in this case, it would address that situation. There's also a concern, and I point this out in this form. You find this in a lot of forms because this is a transportation form. This is not a warehousing form or a storage form. So most of the time you'll find some limitations in the policy that says while the load is being loaded or unloaded at a facility, terminal, warehouse, and other things, we do not consider it covered under the transportation form after it's been there for 72 hours. This is and usually it doesn't include Sundays and holidays. Again, to remind you, since each form can be different, sometimes the 72 hours are not there. This is not as much of a problem with truckload carriers. It would be a problem with less than truckload carriers who might bring things back to the facility and do a cross-docking operation where they take it from one truck, from one trailer, and put it in another trailer to further transportation. It could be a consideration for the truckload carrier if for some reason they picked it up on a Friday that had to be delivered on a Monday yet the trip would only take a one-day trip to get it to the destination. So the question is, what do they do with it during that period of time? Do they take it to a terminal, which would be the safe place to take it, or a storage area that would make sure the property is protected? And again, we will still consider it in transportation for that 72 hours. After that 72 hours, we would not consider that, because now the insured has extended their obligation longer and now would be acting as a warehousing or other facilities here. So again, the 72 hours is important, particularly for truckload carriers, particularly truckload carriers who have a warehouse facility and or a storage facility. In those cases, you would need to coordinate the coverage for a warehouse liability and a storage liability with the cargo coverage to determine when one policy would start and the other policy would cease. Motor carrier coverage form, again, this is, quote, preferred. In return for the premiums stated here in the Marine, we will pay on your behalf those sums that you become, again, legally obligated to pay as a motor carrier for hire for direct, again, not care custody, common or contract carrier, just for hire of damage or covered property of others in your care custody control, again, on a covered auto course of transit. And this is the owner's coverage form that's added to it. Those are things that we talked about before, and this is typical wording today where you cover both legal liability of property of others and owner's property. So when you look at each form, and I'm not here even suggesting that there could be some material difference in this stuff, but one of them said care, custody, and control, others said care, custody, or control. Again, or is far more favorable than and, because and requires 3 considerations, or requires 1. Legal obligated to pay, that's all of them. Yeah, it's a property form, so the triggering coverage is that they're legally obligated to pay. Common contract carrier, again, no big deal other than that terminology is antiquated in today's trucking marketplace. The covered auto will be a consideration. We'll talk about that later because that's a defined term. Some of them refer to a bill of lading or shipping receipt issued by you, which is our insured, or on their behalf. Again, this is a concern. A lot of them don't have that part of it. Even though I said earlier the bill of lading is a major consideration both at claim time and at issuance time. But again, the concern is, is that a requirement for having it in your insured's name? Owned and non-owned property. Fortunately, a lot of these forms now combine those two. Some of your insurers act on as a for-hire carrier some of the time, but some of the larger shippers who have their own fleets will haul their own property one way and then haul other people's property back the other way, so they have a combined operation. And so there you would want to consider that. Due course of transit, does it allow layover? Does it allow rest periods? Do those kind of things? When is it delivered? When the insurer is no longer responsible for it? Does the form include loading or unloading? Does the bill of lading require loading and unloading? Some forms extend coverage for loading and unloading. I read one the other day that says we cover loading and unloading, but not if happen to be loaded and unloaded by a mechanical device not attached to the power unit. Meaning the cargo form tracks the auto liability form for the difference of auto coverage and general liability coverage, dealing with it being unloaded by a forklift. So if you're insured as a customer like the one that I even visited today that has a mulch, where they have a flatbed operation, they take their forklift with them as they're hauling on behalf of this mulch company. They have an obligation to deliver that those pallets of mulch on the back of this flatbed truck with that forklift. They get to the job site, they unload the forklift and start unloading the cargo. And if then a loss happens, that would not be covered under the cargo policy, because now it's being unloaded by a forklift that's not attached, or unloading apparatus not attached to the carrying compartment or to the covered auto. So that would be consideration if your insureds are flatbed operators and if your insureds are unloading with forklifts or cranes or things like that, because clearly items could be damaged during that process, and if that happened, your insured would still be responsible for it because it did not get to the final destination, yet because it was being loaded and unloaded by an apparatus not attached to the unit or not by hand, then there is no coverage in this area. So I would be concerned with that kind of wording if you found it on for a flatbed operator or even a dry van operator where there is forklift unloading or other unloading by the insured. Also, remember the 72-hour limitation for a location where it's sitting there for movement further, and typically this would happen when you have a delivery date that can be met in a shorter period of time than what it takes than what's obviously obligated or required to deliver it or can deliver it. Some delivery points are not open on weekends or other things. Let's look at covered property. We cover the following property unless the property excluded or subject limitation. Property in vehicles. We will cover direct loss caused by covered peril to property of others described on the schedule of coverage while in the due course of transit, including loading and unloading. That's favorable wording. Covers limitation. We only cover property of others while in the course of transit or in a vehicle. We only cover loading and unloading if property of others is loaded from or unloaded onto a sidewalk, street, loading dock, or similar area that's adjacent to a vehicle. Again, how far is adjacent to? And here again, the time limitation. We only cover lost property of others up to 72 hours following the arrival of the property at the intended destination. A lot of times, particularly drop and hook operations, your insured gets to the delivery point. The delivery point's not open, so they're there waiting to go into the gate the next day or the day after. Again, 72 hours is pretty good time frame. Most of the situations I'm bringing up here probably would never happen in this case, but again, just knows there is a limitation. Covered property will include goods and merchandise while loading or unloading by you or your employees, loading for shipment into the course of transit, except limited by the paragraph not covered. Here again, this doesn't require from movement of the equipment not attached, nor does it require to be delivered by the sidewalk or on a way adjacent to the auto itself. This allows for movement beyond that terminology, even by a forklift or a crane or some of those items. Covered cargo is used in this coverage form, means goods and merchandise which are the property of others in the due course of transit, scheduled auto again, within 1,000 feet of the scheduled auto or trailer. Again, I've seen some that say 100 feet. I've seen some for auto haulers that has 5,000 feet. And so we have a situation where one policy says they'll do loading and unloading, but only to areas adjacent to the cargo. One form that we just said does not have a limitation to have the loading unloading area adjacent to the covered auto. This one does it within 1,000 feet. Again, the point I'm making here is I don't know if any of these things are right or wrong for your insured. It depends on what their operation is, which requires you as a retail agent to understand those things and communicate that to your market to make sure those things are covered. They're property not covered. Accounts and bills, that's very similar. Bullion, gold, silver, platinum, and other precious alloys. We'll talk about that in a minute, or metals. My question there is, now there are things like copper. That's the #1 item here. Does copper now meet that definition of precious alloys or metals? Some carriers do consider that. And also, I'm going to show you in a minute where a carrier adds copper onto that list here. So you need to be aware of that. Paintings, statues, and other works of art not covered because those are hard to put value. We don't cover the auto itself. We don't cover the tarps, fittings, intermodal containers. Those need to be covered by the physical damage coverage of the trailer or by trailer interchange coverage and items like that. Loss of property in the course of illegal transportation or trade. This is an interesting concern. We understand contrabands, which are just illegal property. Again, I don't know how this would do, and I'm the only one to raise this question, but having come back for a ski trip in Colorado where the selling of the marijuana is legal, it would be if you transported marijuana in Colorado, then it's not a contraband, but if you went across the border, then it probably is. But the one I want to point out here, now that we took care of that situation, is illegal transportation. And the point I'm making here is today, because of MAP 21, which we've been into now for about 16 months, if your insured has arranged transportation taking part in transportation and allows another motor carrier to haul it without broker's authority, that's an illegal transportation, because now you cannot allow another motor carrier to haul the goods that you have arranged, that your insurer has arranged as a motor carrier without broker's authority. I'm not sure if we can invoke that. I'm not sure this is intention to it, but again, this is another situation where if your insurer doesn't clearly divide chain or have a separate operation between transportation and brokerage, and you issue one cargo form covering both, they could have this situation come up. And so that would be my concern with that wording there. And again, operation. How do they have brokerage? Do they allow other motor carriers to transport goods? Is the broker's authority if they have it in separate legal entities or not? That would be the consideration, the concern. Property not covered. Property for which no bill of lading, shipping receipt, contracted carriage, or tariff has been issued by you on your behalf. So I looked at one policy that said, a policy that says we only cover property that where you're legally liable under a bill of lading that's issued on your behalf or by you, and we see exclusion that if it has not been issued by you or to you, then there's no coverage. So if you have an insured who allows another motor carrier to haul a load for them, and that both of those motor carriers have the same cargo form, there's no coverage in the carrier who arranged for that load, whose bill of lading it's named in, because now it's it would, if they have this exclusion in here, then they would not have coverage for it. And if some other motor carrier had it, and the bill of lading was not in their name, then there would not be coverage for it either. So that would be a situation where would not be coverage for any of those items. Live animals. Some form exclude live animals. Some form exclude live animals if the animals have to be destroyed at the accident site. Some forms extend it beyond those, where you take care of not only the live animals, but you take care of any death or destruction that has to be later done to the animal because of them being damaged or have pneumonia or have other things happen to them at the accident site. We don't cover the cargo itself. Intermodal, again, is an item that most cargo policies doesn't cover. This does allow some coverage for intermodal unless included in the value of the shipment. So here's where you might have some intermodal covered in the cargo form. We don't have time to talk about intermodal, so we don't have time to get into this detail here, but that's a growing industry, and that's the thing that you need to be understood that in an intermodal situation, that the container, the non-wheeled container, the insured that you have is still in their possession, and therefore we need to cover it. The traditional way to do it is to cover it under trailer interchange coverage, but it can be covered under cargo. Cargo has an advantage to be covered under cargo because now you're dealing with one carrier for both the cargo inside the container and the container itself. You also are dealing with one deductible and a lot of times one adjuster. Property while waterborne, and that again, if you involved in those items, hauling things like that, which most of the time would not be involved in your typical motor carrier. Property that's been delivered. We do not cover property of others, again, after 72 hours. Storage. We do not cover property you hold in storage under warehouse and receipt. So again, if your insurers do both of those combinations, you need to coordinate those two policies. We don't cover trailers, containers, or conveyance. We do not cover any intermodal container, trailer, or any other carrying conveyance, including equipment or supplies. My question here, because now we're going beyond just the intermodal container, how about the chicken coops? How about the aluminum vats that a lot of seafood is shipped in? Those are equipment and supplies that are a part of the needing to hold those items, and sometimes those are owned by the insured's customers. So we need to look at those to make sure they're covered also and not excluded when you have wording like this. This is an old form, and I see it here even in the more in the broader forms that you might have. This is the cotton gin 72-hour requirement for you who are familiar with the process of cotton and ginning cotton. To clean cotton, you have to rake the impurities out of it a part of the time. Like, you know, if you rub your hand on your pants legs or your dress, you'll know that it gets hot from the friction. Well, cotton, ginning cotton aggravates the barbs or other things in it that could be smoldered there, and if you put it on the back of a truck and run down the highway at 55, 60 miles an hour, you've introduced oxygen to a combustible product that has a ember in it, and it will burn up. So what this says is, let it burn up in a warehouse. Typically today this isn't a concern, but again, we have this left in a lot of these older policies. I point these other things out here. This is an auto, but there are some times where property would be covered. Here's automobile homes, recreation vehicles, but goes on to milk and bulk liquor, eggs, live animals, glass, poultry, other things, unless caused by a named cause of loss. So it's not broad like the other forms you have. There's a additional limitation in this, and of course the biggest one that's missing here would be theft. And so this is what they're trying to limit from, and there'd be no coverage for theft. So that would be a concern you would have depending on the nature of what your insurer's hauling. But if they don't haul any of these items, then so what? So beyond the typical live animals, copper. I had a situation where a agent called me up and said, insured called me up, a lawyer, which I did not take the case, and they asked me about, I have a renewal situation where the original policy issued to the motor carrier, I did not exclude copper, and the renewal policy that was delivered, again, the key word there is renewal, did exclude copper, and this motor carrier, who had never had a claim for copper and didn't haul copper on a normal basis, ended up hauling copper, having stolen, and the carrier, of course, denied coverage because of the copper being now an excluded item, whereas it was added to the policy renewal, and the agent nor the company pointed that out to the insured. And that's a dilemma, because now, without reading the policies and without reading any additional exclusions and or limitations added at renewal, somebody's getting involved in a suit in that, which you don't want to do. It's not in your contract, or if you don't have broker's authority, could it not be illegal in the 72-hour time limitation. Cause of losses, exclusion. Legal liability by a covered cause of loss. Typically it is broad form. Typically most items are covered. I gave you the exception before on certain types of commodities, might not be where you have the named cause of losses, but most of the time it is covered for those things unless it's excluded. We typically exclude government action, we typically exclude nuclear contamination, but you have some other things. Liability for loss or cause resulting from the following: improper packing or storing or rough handling. That's also an advantage of that, because that would be shipper error, and the Carmack Amendment would not make you responsible for that. Delay, loss, or markets, or intentional loss, or other indirect losses. Again, Carmack would not make you responsible for that. If Carmack was waived and your insured assumes responsibility for that, then there could be a gap in coverage. Breakdown refrigeration equipment. This is where you have a temperature-sensitive load, but we will pay for loss caused directly by, again, named cause of losses. And so this is a concern. One of the things we're going to look at here is if your insured has a reefer operation. That's beyond Colorado and California and Washington. Reefers are refrigerating controlling devices. That's where the term reefer comes from. And the key, anytime that wording is provided, is breakdown. So it's up to the insured to prove the breakdown of the property. Dishonest or criminal acts committed by you or any of your partners. Employees. Another wording here is we exclude, again, dishonest acts by manager, members of your limited liability company, anyone else with an interest in the property, or their employees, authorized representative, or anyone else with whom the property is entrusted for any purposes. This exclusion applies whether or not such persons are acting alone in coercion. So again, this is including not only the employees, but anyone else they have given to. Here's another form for the same intentional dishonest or illegal acts committed alone in collusion with any of you, your partners, members, or managers. Any to others who are interested, or any employee of yours other than executive officers, directors, but yet there's a give back on the next page here. However, if you do a criminal background check for that employee and you find nothing that is bad in that criminal background check, then this excludes, and you do it within 30 days of the employment, then the employee's dishonest provision in this is waived. So again, you have the employees, and then the third form here is we will not pay loss or damage caused by resulting from any of the following, the dishonest criminal acts by you, your partners, directors, trustees, officers, or members. This exclusion does not apply to your employees or independent contractors. So the three forms that we have here is, the first form we looked at excludes dishonest acts by employees. The second form excludes dishonest acts by employees, but if your insured does a criminal background check and finds nothing wrong with those, and they do it within 30 days of employment, then that employee's dishonesty exclusion is met, is not effective. Or here's one that does not have an employee's dishonesty exclusion in it. In fact, it says in clear language that this exclusion does not apply to your employee independent contractor. This has a lot, if you're insured as an owner-operator, they drive their own truck, so what? Because all three take coverage away from the you, which is our insured, for dishonest acts. But again, in the other situation, when they start hiring people, now there's a concern you have here. And again, how you feel about this, you need to explain this, because if you replace one of these forms that does not cover employees or does not exclude dishonest acts by employees with one that does, then you have potentially E&O exposure. Or if you don't explain, yes, we exclude employees, but if you do a criminal background check and meets the requirement, then that exclusion doesn't apply, and talk about the proper way of doing that, then you have a concern there. Will not pay for liability cause resulting from any of the following: loss of market, again, consequential damages, and again, resulting dishonest acts by the acts, and then they build the cotton gin exclusion here in not property not covered, but in exclusions. Or we add your operations transportation broker or a freight forwarder. That's a provision in the D2 that would be added to this form. And again, I strongly recommend that we separate authority. I have a real problem with a motor carrier having both transportation authority and brokerage or freight forward authority, the same legal entity. This coverage form spells that out and would take coverage away from the broker or the freight forwarder if it's the same legal entity as was issued the cargo policy itself. Breakdown mechanical refrigeration equipment or associated components, parts thereof. Again, the key words there's breakdown. But they also, any loss are due to change in temperature. Unless the failure is caused by resulting from the fire, again, a named cause of loss, or collapse or failure, sagging or warping or twisting of the frames. Again, there's concern there on this part of it. And so this would be important if you're insured or hauling temperature controlled commodities. If they're having a dry van operation, who cares? Because they're not hauling temperature sensitive commodities. So look at the change in temperature. There are a number of forms out there that do not exclude either dampness or wetness or change in temperatures. Some of them exclude it and provide buyback endorsements. Some of them provide buyback within the exclusion itself that says we exclude a change in temperatures unless caused by a breakdown of mechanical device, or we exclude wetness and dampness, but not if the load was properly covered at time of movement. You want to look at dishonest acts, employer or not. Does it include independent contractors or not? Is required to have employees not excluded, meaning the background checks. Again, the bill of lading is not in the name, and we don't cover consequential damages, loss of market, which tracks the carback responsibility. We also look at, and key part of any legal liability form is the right and duty to defend. This form says we have the right and duty to defend an insured. This form says we have the option to defend any suit brought against the insured, and we'll pay for that. And the other form has here is no duty to defend. We will provide if we provide defense. So you have one that says we have the duty to defend. You have one that says it's our option to defend, and one that says we have no duty to defend. But if we do, we'll pay it. So again, that's a big consideration here because this is a legal liability form, and if the insured gets sued by their customer for any cargo damage, then which form would be better to protect your insured is the one that would have a duty to defend. Earned freight and debris removal. All forms that I've looked at have those two items. Earned freight is the business interruption payment or the payment for hauling the goods from point A to point of the accident that the insured cannot collect for. This form covers those losses up to whatever limit they have. You have some earned freight here. We cover earned freight charges that you're unable to collect resulting from a loss. Again, unlimited. However, the coverage extension, not unlimited. The coverage extension here is limited to $2,500. This is pollution cleanup. This form provides pollution cleanup coverage to the form of $10,000. Now, if you went to auto liability and went to our previous classes or our previous webinar there, you know it's a major concern, particularly with the MCIEF 90 for pollution cleanup. A lot of our carriers add the pollution cleanup buyback, the standard ISO CA 9948, and that would pay for pollution cleanup in absence of it being in the cargo form. However, if it's in the cargo form, and this particular form here has 10,000, where this form has 25,000 in it, you would collect that first, and then after that, you would step into the CA 9948. This is for not pollution, but this is for the debris removal, which is 25,000 here. So you need to look at the limits in the debris removal, the earned freight, and the pollution cleanup. Some forms don't have that. With the buyback, is it needed or not? Again, explain it to the insured. This is an important part here. Unless prior to any loss you have agreed, we do not, the salvage is given to the insurance carrier. Unless prior to any loss you have agreed by written contract to the contrary, and any salvage or loss will accrue entirely to our benefit until the sum here. There are some property that the insured has that requires particular care, like pharmaceuticals, high value items, things that require warranty, that will have no salvage. In other words, during the bill of lading, the bill of lading will allow for all salvage to be in the control of the owner of the property, of the customer. That's major point if your insurance involved in those items to determine if salvage is in the control of the shipper or receiver. Therefore, you want to make sure your policy allows for that provision so that they will honor that written contract. Towing, again, some of them involved in that. Reload expenses, traffic control. A lot of forms have these kind of things in. Towing, which would be record bills that would be involved in both the physical damage coverage and in the cargo coverage, would have to be there. A lot of times it's not just towing the wrecked items away, but we have to pick up the cargo all over that's been spilled all over the ground. We have to control the traffic around it. We might have to have another trucker or another motor carrier to carry it to another point where all those things be paid. Covered auto means any power unit designed for travel on public roads which is being operated exclusively in your business as a motor carrier for hire, or a private carrier meets at least one of the following conditions. And then we have for scheduled means any vehicle listed in motor carriers page as scheduled vehicle, vehicle while permanently replace one of those, temporary substitute, and you have newly acquired. You need to determine those. One of the things here, though, is a problem is this F, a trailer that is not any trailer while physically attached to a scheduled vehicle. That wording is more limited than the rest of them. There is a give back in this form that says a trailer that's unattached from a scheduled vehicle, provided that at the time the unattached trailer was being used in your business. It's unattached as a direct result of a breakdown or for unattached for less than 48 hours. The older forms that you see require the carrying compartment to be attached to a described power unit. The more modern forms, the more current update forms do not have that provision in it. A lot of brokers won't accept that provision, so you need to be aware of that too. Here's covered auto, any power unit designed for travel public roads which is being operated exclusively in your business as a motor carrier for hire. If the policy is written on, again, reporting firm, all power units owned or leased to you. If the policy is written on schedule or described vehicle basis, those power units shown in that schedule. Again, not referring to the trailer, but referring to the power units. In due course of transit means being shipped as being shipped from the time assumed in the insurer's care, custody, or control until delivered to be responsible for. So again, and this form here includes loading and unloading, is included in that definition, a due course of transit. Transit means the shipment of covered property by you, beginning at the point of transportation where you accept property into your care, custody, and control. Includes the ordinary, reasonable, and necessary stops, layovers, those items, and it ends when the consignee has accepted it at the delivery point. Due course transit means being shipped from the time you assume care, custody, and control. Again, that's different than responsible for. Very similar here, but here again we have the 72-hour after arrival or destination added to it. There is a couple forms that have some theft limitations. I want to point this out because note we add 6 here. Copper or copper products will be excluded here. And so if your insurers are hauling any of these things, this is limited to 10% of those items here. Again, a consideration that you have. If your insurer does not haul any of these, then there's no real big deal. Customs cargo. Claims handling effects on customers' relationship with insured. Key consideration. Claims handling. Most important from insured standpoint. Motor carrier's relationship with their customers. There is a big difference if the unit is a sealed unit or not sealed. If it's sealed, then you have limited theft. If your insurer can track the seal and get someone to sign off on it that said when it was shipped it had the seal number on it, when delivered it was still sealed with that number, you prevent theft. But sometimes the shipper loads and counts, so your insured cannot verify that. So the verification of what's being hauled now is up to the shipper to prove that under CARMAC. The care of the cargo, the bill of lading requirements spell out the care of the cargo. And so again, shipper error if they tell you the wrong place to deliver it, or if it's with an item that's temperature sensitive and they don't tell what temperature it has to be held at, then you could not deny the claim because of shipper error. That's not going to make your insured customer happy, but that protects us from the paying for things where the shipper didn't properly package it or the shipper didn't properly divulge how the care of it must be during the transportation. Coverage consideration that affect fleets who expect everything to be covered. That's the customer's typical requirements. Bill of lading, who issues it? Is there a tariff? Does a CARMAC amendment is included in the tariff? That's, again, important in underwriting and at loss time. Concern, what's a covered auto? All owned or non-owned, or requirement for the carrying compartment to be attached. Exposure, when legally liable, typically not defended, but you have care, custody, and control, or care, custody, or control. Drop and hook is a concern here because a lot of times your insured assumes responsibility for it when they drop it until it's unloaded, even though it's still not hooked up to their item, or when it's being loaded and is put out into a staging area, they could assume responsibility before it gets hooked onto their item. So you need to look at those situations, particularly when the insured does not have the responsibility for the loading and unloading. Use of another carrier, the bill of lading by the insured's name required, or just legally liable. The insurance agreement will spell that out about the bill of lading is in your name, meaning your insured's name or not. Concern continue. Exclusions, limitations, and coverage. Bill of lading another motor carrier's name. Employees' dishonesty, criminal, fraudulent, dishonest, or illegal acts. Again, our employees, is there a buyback or is it excluded? Change in temperature, that's a spoilage. The mechanical breakdown coverage, is it contained in the policy or does it have to add by endorsement? When it's a damage, a major exposure for flatbeds, is there a requirement to have a tarped or not? And there's a give back. Certain commodities that we mentioned here, animals, cotton, eggs, copper, and those items. Cargo that has potential for total losses when only part is damaged. Pharmaceuticals, now with the food products, or designer items, protection of the manufacturer, cars, equipment, high-end clothing, and those kind of things. The customer then assumes salvage, and so you need to make sure if you get involved in that. Theft-prone cargo, are they in the bad areas? And what are the preventions to that? And then the last thing, the terminal coverage for the 72 hours. Remember the customer requirements. They usually set the limit. So you have to meet what's required, but you also have to remember that the motor carrier is responsible for whatever the value is, even though the customer doesn't require that high of a limit. What's being shipped, information from the insured, who are their customers. You want to look at the percentage of each. Central Analysis Bureau information helps us fill this out. SAFER shows us what the motor carrier told the government they would haul. Other problems with this, just on time delivery, that's consequential damages. Load from broker, sometimes the broker doesn't tell you exactly what the value of the loads are, and their insurance requirement can be less than what the load's worth. Then the customer control salvage, that's to protect their brand. That things could be contaminated like the pharmaceuticals and food that then could damage the public. What is cargo? Theft prone, property not covered or limited. Is it perishable? Temperature change with a buyback. Temperature control devices, warranty to maintain must be broke down. Things that are breakable. Again, the shipper error, how properly are they packaged it? And then are the property not covered involving name, cause of losses, or other things. Where it's going, to and from, routes, layover, terminals, the 72 hours, who's responsible for loading, unloading, and the rigging is a consideration. That's the end of this 4 hours of the CE for Inland Marine, and we hope you got something out of it, particularly cargo, which is the line of coverage that most of you all like. We look forward to you gaining your CE credits through these webinars that provide for members of the Motor Carriers Insurance Education Foundation. Thank you for your time and your attention.